Okay, so Unit 2, we're setting the scene. Unit 3, we start looking at how organizations organize for innovation. So when I first started thinking about this topic, I started to reflect on my own experience. I used to work for Hewlett-Packard before I became an academic, and I used to work in innovation in relation to email systems, financial systems. One of the things that struck me during that process of working at Hewlett-Packard was how informal many of the processes are within organizations that are truly successful in their innovation. After leaving HP, I did an MBA. And what I found on that MBA was that many of the things that were talked about, in particular around innovation, focused on the formal structures, the formal strategies, the formal processes. Now, whilst all of those things are important to the innovation process, I couldn't help but reflect on my own experiences, and I'm sure you might be reflecting on your own as well, that actually the informal processes and structures are really important. And by informal structures, I mean things like, for example, social networks. And actually social networks, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest this, are really how work gets done in organizations. So whilst the organizational chart, the formal structure is really important, we shouldn't lose sight of the social processes, the social structures that exist. So in this particular unit, Unit 3, I'm going to be looking at two groups of things. One is the formal organization, if you like. So that is, how do successful organizations formally organize? What is the kind of structure and the mode of organizing they use? One way of looking at the formal structures is to categorize them in relation to mechanistic, bureaucratic modes of organizing on the one hand, and what you might call more organic modes on the other. Organizations such as Hewlett-Packard are more towards the organic, so they have lower levels of bureaucracy, they have a flatter hierarchy. Bureaucratic organizations, as you can imagine, more bureaucracy, higher levels. So what we're going to look at in terms of the formal organization is how do innovative organizations organize in relation to these two things. What we see is actually mechanistic organizations are very, very powerful for efficiency. And this is something that might come into play when we're thinking about operations management. So that good for consistency, good for quality, some of the things that you heard Elke talk about a few minutes ago. However, on the other side, organic organizations are really good for innovation. Now the tension comes from organizations such as Hewlett-Packard being involved in both production, which requires efficiency, quality, consistency, and innovation, which requires this organic mode. So one of the things that we'll talk about in the module in this particular unit is how do organizations manage that tension? And partly it's about what is sometimes called the ambidextrous organization, the ability to, if you like, to write with two hands. And what you'll see is some departments are organic. They have a much looser hierarchy, much less bureaucracy. And those departments that need to be more bureaucratic, like finance, accounting, production perhaps, these tend to be more mechanistic. So we'll look at this formal side of organizing. We'll also look a bit at the formal process, so the stage model of innovation, what stages do companies typically go through when they're developing new products, new services. Having looked at the formal organization, I want to turn to then looking at the informal organization. And I'm actually interested not just in how companies formally project manage projects, I'm also interested in innovation as a social, political, and emotional process. And by a social process, I mean, for example, the way that we as individuals interact with others to get ideas from different parts of the organization through informal means, our social network. By political, I mean the way that we might use our social network to get individuals to coalesce and support our ideas. And by emotional, well, any of you who have been involved in the innovation process will know that it involves anxiety. I guess when you've been successful, it actually involves joy. If you've been involved in big projects like I've been in the past, which have been axed, it can almost feel like a wake, where you actually feel that you've had a loss. So I want to explore a little bit about the social, political, emotional aspects of the innovation process, because they actually involve the importance of team management and how do team leaders manage these social, political processes. Team management isn't just about managing process, it's about managing people, which is obvious, I'm sure. And the last thing I want to look at in Unit 3 is to focus on the importance of serendipity, informality, deviance, things that we tend to ignore as managers, and these things are actually really important to the innovation process. When we're thinking about management, we tend to think about control. It's very difficult to control the creative process. The creative process is better represented by metaphors such as fermentation, journey. And the idea of fermentation is not one that is about managing and controlling. Fermentation is very difficult to control. Journeys can be very difficult to control. You might want to know where you're going, but the journey that you take there might have passes through various cul-de-sacs and ways which you might have to come back and get en route. So I'm going to be using different metaphors to look at the innovation process, not just project management, but the idea of fermentation, the idea of the journey.